Good afternoon, listeners. Welcome to episode 23 of Wear Many Hats. Today, we are joined by a very interesting individual from the British International Investment. We have Sam Pickford here with us today, who is the Head of Procurement at the British International Investment. Hi, Sam. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
You have a good day?
Yeah, it was busy, but okay.
Busy, yeah. We're your 11th meeting, I understand.
I think so, yeah. I think I started at 9. It's been pretty much full on since. Yeah.
Full on.
Yeah.
Well, that's it, working in the public sector, isn't it? Well, the public/private.
Yeah. I think it's the middle. It's the way the world's going at the moment. It's like working week is being compressed into the middle.
Yeah, let's squeeze as much out as we can. Yeah. No, understand that completely. Understand it completely. Well, listen, thank you very much for joining us on the show. Should we get straight into the questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, look, Sam, you've had a very interesting and varied career in procurement. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey in procurement and how you've got to where you are now?
Yeah, so I think as most people do with procurement, they kind of fall into it at some random point.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that very few people set out to kind of go, I'm going to be a buyer or a procurement person.
Yeah.
I was working at West Sussex in an accounts payable role.
Right.
And a job came up in procurement. One of my friends was doing procurement. Right. And so I asked him what he did. It paid more than the job I was in, so I went for it.
Right.
And that was really it. It was a opportunity at the right time when I was looking, and I was very lucky to know someone who's doing it when I didn't know what it was really. So it wasn't a particularly rational choice at the start, but it was there. Let's give it a go. I was at West Sussex County Council, and with any county council, you get fairly varied lot of things. You know, it's everything from facilities, to social care, to looking after aspects of the pension fund.
You become a jack of all trades, really.
Yeah. And West Sussex was going through a period of transformation at the time. I was immediately outsourced into Capita.
Oh, right.
When I was there. I knew that taking the role.
Yeah.
But, it was at a period of transformation. And in periods of transformation, it's a very good opportunity to learn a lot. And, there were a lot of changes within the team. So I was really thrown in at the deep end from day one, kind of given a £7 million contract, day one, kind of, here's our process manual. We want to see if the process manual works. Here's a £7 million contract. Go and run a procurement. Not that I'd ever, I'd only just learned what procurement meant at the time.
No stress. No stress at all.
And then it's kind of, this seems to be going, well, here's a large social care procurement. Go and do social care now.
Right.
And that was really it. I was very lucky in so much that I got a very diverse portfolio very quickly.
Right.
And my peers happened to be leaving as I was joining. So I was out of necessity. I was given a lot more than perhaps most people are given in kind of a fairly junior role.
Right.
But it meant I learned quickly. And you're working with a very diverse range of stakeholders within the local authority. Weirdly, I would say as well within a local authority, it's probably the most commercial place I've ever worked in, which is not what you expect when you're talking about.
That's quite an interesting statement, Sam.
But the reason is that you're forced to do, public sector's perpetually cut. Whoever's in charge, they're always having to make some level of saving.
Yeah.
So you have to be commercial you have to get a lot out of what very little money you have.
Of course.
So especially within kind of social care, a lot of emphasis is going how you manage your cost, how suppliers are managing their cost. Right. Every single penny is accounted for and has to be spent appropriately.
Yeah.
So you find yourselves kind of having to be very creative with have to build good, solid relationships with your suppliers because you're asking them to do way more than is of commercial benefit to them.
Right. Okay.
For the money that you have available. So it was a good place to learn.
Right.
And from there, I kind of moved. After a few years, going into Capita, then back into the council, right, into a different wing of the procurement team, into the strategic side of it. Right. I learned a lot very quickly in those few years, and then
certainly sounds like it. Certainly sounds like the variation has been very good for you.
Yeah, and so I moved into consultancy not long after.
Right.
Again, focused very much around local authorities. So worked for kind of various borough councils. In London boroughs, Bedford, did some Northern Irish councils. Again, just small scale, kind of very much kind of doing what I was already doing, but for a consultancy firm.
Yeah.
Didn't particularly like the sales side of consultancy,
right?
But kind of like the freedom.
Yeah.
So I only did that for a few months and decided I'd be a consultant, but for myself. So I went into more of an interim space, and from there I moved into rail, so working for Transport for London.
Yeah.
Did that for a few years.
Yeah, I see that you won a few awards.
Yeah,
while you were with Transport for
a
London.
lot of what we were doing there. So when I was brought in, it was essentially they were running a procurement, but it kind of got to a standstill, and it was being run by a team who didn't really do procurement. They were good commercial people, but they did cost management and contract management.
Yeah.
And had been tasked with doing a large procurement around a program. So my job really was to kind of unstick this procurement and kind of get it moving again.
Yeah.
So a lot of what we did there was kind of as much as we were doing the procurement activity, which is the bulk of why I was there, it was working with the team to kind of refocus them a bit, build up their kind of procurement skill set, and make it more kind of aligned with the program we were delivering.
Right.
And I was very fortunate there to work with, because my manager at the time was very much a sponsor of their graduate scheme. So we had some really good, very fresh people coming in off the commercial graduate scheme. And unlike other areas of the business at the time, we were giving them real substantive work because we didn't really have a procurement team.
Yeah.
So it was using them, very keen people, and kind of shaping the procurement function around them and kind of their keenness. The broader program was fantastic in terms of its diversity as well. For an engineering team, it was very young, very diverse, which traditionally engineering teams within the UK aren't.
Yeah.
Whereas the head of engineering within our program had very much a focus on kind of getting the best people wherever their background, wherever they're from, and kind of really challenging kind of the hegemony around kind of what an engineer should be.
Yeah.
So we had a very young, dynamic team within that program.
Yeah.
And the awards we were nominated for and went for were very much around collaboration and kind of innovative thinking.
Yeah.
And they were quite challenging supply chains as well. So we solved some very creative issues. But what we were really good at is working with each of the different departments and kind of building that real collaborative, cohesive function.
Yeah.
So by the end of it, the projects were very much procurement run by the project team, not just us doing our transactional aspect.
Right.
And I think that's, and drag my mind back 6-7 years to when it was. But I think that was the crux of what we went for with those awards. And it was very reflective of kind of the environment we had at the time.
Yeah, because, I mean, to be fair, Sam, you had us geeking out when you came in because we had our pre-podcast chat and Sam mentioned that he'd come here on the Central Line, and as probably most people do, you know, we asked, why is the Central Line so hot? And I'm sure our listeners would love to know why. So fire away, because we found it really interesting. Tell us why.
Yeah, and again, this is me trying to half remember something from 7 years ago.
That's fine.
But I believe it's down to it's the clay it's built through. So the clay acts as a heat sink. It used to absorb the heat, and Central Line, if you looked at it in the 1920s, 1930s, was advertised as the coolest place to be in London on the hot summer day.
Yeah.
So it's kind of come and escape the summer heat, go take a ride on the Central Line.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's not like that today. And the reason it is so hot is over that time, the electrical load from the trains going through the clay at that depth has built up, and kind of the heat has got nowhere to go. The clay has absorbed it all. So any electrical load you're putting through it, it's just going nowhere.
Yeah.
You can't really put aircon on the trains because that's adding to the electrical load.
Yeah.
So it's only going to get hotter if you put aircon in.
Yeah.
And you can't, because of where the Central Line is, to buy the land and to build kind of big vents and kind of to kind of vent the tunnels that way is just prohibitive from a cost perspective.
Yeah.
So all you can really do is mitigate the future electrical load going through and hope that trains and technology become more efficient, and over time you won't make it worse. I think it's unlikely. I don't think you can actually make it cooler, but I think you can stop the rate at which the heat's increasing.
Wow, that is so interesting. So basically, all those people like me that moan about the heat, stop it. There's nothing they can do, basically.
Yeah, well, I think part of the hope is that, you know, things like the Elizabeth Line will help mitigate, because, you know, it does cover some of the same ground.
Yeah.
I think there's a YouTube for London programme. I'm long past knowing where it is, but at some point, I think they will have a more efficient train, which in theory should make it cooler. But,
right. Okay.
who knows?
Who knows? We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. Well, that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Sam. Okay, so sort of moving back to your career. So obviously you're at Transport for London for a period of time. How did you transition into the role that you have now at the British International Investment?
Yeah, so I've been working in and around investment companies so I was at a pension fund before I went to BII.
Yep.
And I'd bought around investment in my local authority days. I'd been involved in kind of tenders for investment management and pension funds. So I knew investment a little bit. I know public procurement very well, so that's the common theme through my career.
Yeah.
But I also have a master's degree in development studies, international development.
Right.
So I'd wanted for a while to kind of link up what my career was with what I intended it to be when I was at university. And an opportunity came along with what was then called CDC Group.
Right.
To essentially do a bit of consultancy at the start. They didn't have a procurement team. They were a growing business. Whilst they are publicly owned, they have an independent board and operate with private characteristics.
Yep.
So it's building a procurement team within that kind of public-private space, which works from kind of responsibility from spending taxpayers' money, but also allows it to be commercial within the environments they work in, which is the broader nature of the business.
So quite a hybrid, quite a hybrid operation in terms of how it works.
Yeah, and it was also building a procurement team in a business which hadn't had one before.
Yep.
So
did you enjoy that out of interest?
Yeah, it was. I think it was interesting at the time because I joined in February 20. So just as COVID was hitting, so I had 3 weeks in the office.
Wow.
And then found myself in a new company, but working remotely, and everyone has been kind of shifted off site very quickly.
Yeah.
So it was challenging building relationships you need to build, and kind of you've got to sell procurement before you do it.
Yeah, completely understand.
So it's finding ways of doing that in an environment which is entirely remote and kind of no end in sight.
Yeah.
When you're doing it, you're also doing it at a point where the business has a lot of competing priorities as well. Because obviously, getting everybody off site for COVID's a huge thing. Making sure the business is functioning.
Yep.
So from a CFO, CRO perspective, at that time, that's their focus. They don't care. Whereas 3 weeks ago, you had their full attention.
Yeah.
Suddenly, that's gone. So you've got to kind of you've got to build it yourself. You can't kind of rely on kind of senior stakeholders to sponsor you because they've got other focuses.
Right.
And the investment side of the business is working with its investees and the companies and the geographies we support to make sure they're transitioning and dealing with the challenges of COVID as well.
Yeah.
And also in any investment company, kind of the macroeconomic state is a big impact and drive on kind of what the business is doing.
Yeah.
So they're not particularly focused on something which is, enabling and kind of didn't exist 3 months ago. They were doing their job perfectly fine.
Yeah.
They've been presented with a huge challenge. So that was the first bit. It was kind of getting the buy-in within the business in a time where there's a lot of flux.
Yeah.
And as important as we think we are, we're not the most important thing to any of those stakeholders at that time.
No.
So it was interesting. I enjoyed it. Like the firm are great. It's very. People always have a kind of an odd conception about investment. They view it as kind of very cutthroat, bad behaviours in terms of the way people treat each other.
Yeah.
Very competitive environment, and
they've got that banking thing in their mind, haven't they? I suppose.
And especially when you're coming from a public sector background, you worry that. You don't, because it's not your environment. It's not the natural home for a public sector space. So you wonder how that's going to work. And actually, it was a very welcoming firm. People are very much there for the broader mission of the firm, which is development. It's working in the geographies, adding kind of, sustainable, productive growth within the countries we work in.
Yeah.
And they're there for all the right reasons. They've often come from an investment background and had to make, a professional sacrifice financially to kind of come into this public sphere but they're doing so because they want to, and because they want to drive the outcomes we're trying to achieve. So it makes for a weirdly pleasant environment for an investment firm.
Right. Okay.
So it has very good characteristics. It's a very collaborative business.
Yeah.
So it's not without its frustrations, but if you're credible and you've got a plan and a strategy, it's fairly easy to live within because people trust you and can get the buy-in. So the barriers were far more esoteric than what you'd expect them to be.
Right. Okay. So basically, it's individuals rather than chasing cash or chasing career advancement. The makeup of the business is individuals that really want to push that forward, help people in those other geographies, and look at bringing those other elements on. Because how many countries do you work in?
I think well, our investment profile is Pan-Africa,
right,
all of South Asia, moving into Southeast Asia, and elements around the Caribbean, and also we're doing something in Ukraine, which was announced recently too.
Right.
So we're quite broad, but in terms of operational countries, I think we have offices or representatives within 10 countries now.
Wow.
And that's across Africa and South Asia.
Right. Okay. And do you deal with all of those countries? And
from twofold really. So we support a lot of the operational buying, so kind of setup of offices, any contracts which go alongside those offices. We've sourced some of the offices ourselves as well.
Yeah.
So there's those aspects, but also with the investment teams working in those geographies, we're supporting in their buying of due diligence around those investments as well.
Right.
And some of the broader programs. So our function is very much kind of twofold. It's kind of supporting operational, but also supporting the investments buying as well.
Right.
And
okay.
we're a small team, but kind of as much as we have categories, it's kind of investment and impact one side, operations, and a bit of the rest of impact on the other.
Yeah, so the values of the business are very important,
Yeah,
and adhered to, and ensure that they're doing the right thing for the right reasons, effectively. Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. Are you enjoying it?
Yeah, it's. I enjoy the diversity of it.
Right.
Even though, kind of say we're centered in 10 countries.
Yep.
Our company has a real breadth to it. We're 600-ish people, and I'd probably say, we're getting close to probably 100 different nationalities within the business.
Wow.
And that's fantastic because you get to learn from so many different experiences.
Yeah.
A real breadth of professional experience as well. Like there's a lot of people who have come from finance or investment, but also people who are kind of the experts at whatever they're investing in said country, or a lot from the impact space. So a lot who've worked for charities before, or consultancies who work around kind of impact and development. So it's quite a broad range. And on the operational side, that too is quite diverse as well. You have people who come from kind of a breadth of backgrounds. There's some who come from public backgrounds like myself.
Yeah.
I've got people in my team from a law firm, another from Transport for London, actually,
and
another who's come from an art buying history. So it's
quite varied then, really, in terms of background.
Yeah, and I think what attracts people to the firm is not so much the buying. Like from a procurement perspective, like our spend isn't massive. We're very much a people-driven business. Our people are our main resource, and
of course.
So there's not too much from a spend perspective. So we're not doing big strategic contracts. A lot of our buying is quite small-scale consultancy.
Yeah,
and even the operational contracts are relatively small from kind of a procurement view.
Yeah,
but it's interesting because of the geographies we work in.
Yeah,
it's interesting the individuals you get to work with. And that's really kind of what attracts people on our side. So you get people who find the company fascinating and the mission fascinating, and that's what draws them in, rather than kind of they're not going to advance their procurement. I hope they are advancing their procurement career, but that's not their main focus in joining us.
Well, I imagine they'd pick up a lot of skills there that they may not pick up elsewhere. Because working with. Within such a multicultural society, we can all learn something from each other, can't we? So, I imagine that they come out with a set of skills that they didn't realise that they could get. Yeah,
I think the biggest thing you get from working with an procurement team is it's negotiating in different countries, and it's the type of things you get in textbooks and things. It's kind of be receptive to kind of cultural norms and kind of understand the landscape and the people you're working with, and we get to do a lot of that. And it's I've been involved in lease negotiations in Nigeria and India, and in Egypt, and they're all completely different.
I bet that's really hard, because you're probably used to dealing with it one way, and then suddenly you've got to do it.
Yeah, but
differently.
I think it's what's enjoyable about it is the challenge of it, and it's getting to learn your stakeholders, getting to learn what is motivating, doing your market research, understanding the economic climate within a country is super critical in our procurement activity. Egypt and Nigeria have challenging economies, and where me dealing with Elise in West Sussex, the macroeconomic is kind of absorbed.
Yes.
Me dealing with it in Cairo or Nigeria, I have to do my research. I have to understand what is driving the market. You understand what motivates the market. The research and the market engagement is more important than ever.
Right.
And you've got to be prepared to kind of learn as you go and kind of listen to people who know better, find people who have done it before, go out and make those connections and kind of find out what the drivers are. Understanding like local geography and things is a huge thing, because a lot of the work we started with was very remote because of COVID. But you still need to understand what are the motivating factors around kind of transport and such. You can't just kind of take what the agents are giving you. You've got to speak to local people, understand that, well, actually, they say they're going to build a tube station over here, but they're not, or there's a bus route which runs around here, which a lot of our staff get, or, those type of things which are important, or the safety factors kind of, because you can't get that from Google. You've got to make connections with people. And you've got to spend the time having those conversations and kind of iterating and building your view based on those conversations.
Yeah. So does your role by its nature also involve quite a bit of travel into these countries?
Not massive.
Right.
We try and target it like when it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
We're becoming a lot more conscious around sustainability with travel as well. So,
of course. Yeah.
There's a necessity in certain areas, but not always. So with the first office I did, we did it entirely remote. Yeah. Because of COVID, it wasn't ideal, but we were still able to build a functional office, halfway around the world.
That's quite impressive. That is quite impressive, given the.
Well, you learn ways of kind of doing it. You rely a lot more on your local stakeholders, and you kind of asking people in the business who don't normally take up roles around kind of the procurement or facility side to kind of do a bit of be your eyes and ears on the ground and kind of. Bring them more into the conversation rather than delivering something for them. That they're more involved in the actual delivery.
Okay.
You find tricks like getting your CCTV installed so you can get better view of the construction as it's going. Those type of things. And you're finding good local supply partners who you can trust.
Right.
You've got to be really hot on your evaluation of your suppliers in those spaces because you are a lot more reliant on them.
Yeah.
So, it's building up the credibility of your supply chain.
Yeah.
Making sure they can do what they say they're going to do. And you can't fix it after the fact. You've got to get your procurement absolutely right. Yeah. Because you're stuck with them once you've got them. So, and you're a lot more trusted to engulf them.
Right. Okay. That's fascinating, actually. Like a really fascinating glimpse into, yourself and also what your business does on a daily basis.
Yeah. And I have been able to kind of, more recently, I've been able to go to Mumbai and to Lagos as part of the job. I'm very fortunate to do so.
How do you find the humidity in Mumbai?
Mumbai was all right because there's a lot of Mumbai really surprised me because I've been to India a few times.
Yeah.
And everyone says, "Oh, Mumbai is kind of super busy city. It's exhausting," and I found it such a relaxing place, relatively speaking.
Really,
it's a really modern city now.
Right.
The business district is really growing. And the infrastructure in Mumbai is really good now. It's still evolving and there's a lot of work. It still takes an hour to get from south to north. Yeah. But the ability to do business there has really changed, I think, recently. And it's a very, it's an emerging market. But it feels very modern in a way you wouldn't necessarily expect. Yeah. And it's very there's more thought around kind of the modern elements, right? So it's less organic than it perhaps once was, right? But yeah, no, I really liked it, and I find it very easy, like compared to kind of people, how hard people can present it as.
Yeah. Well, we all have different experiences. You know, I mean, I could go somewhere and experience something. You could be there at the same time. I could have a terrible time, and you could have the best time in the world. You know, that's just the way of the world, I think.
Yeah.
But that's really interesting. Thank you for being, for giving us that insight. It's really, really interesting. So, what advice would you give to a young professional that was looking to start a career in procurement?
I think the key thing for me is you've got to view it as a fairly undefined role these days. And I think still, I've been on kind of panels at SIPs and kind of, there's no consistent view of what a procurement person does.
Right.
Still, it's still very varied. And it varies massively between companies.
Yeah.
So, but you've got to see that as a positive, and you've got to kind of go in with a very open mind, I think, and a willingness to view it as a job which isn't transactional. I think if you view it through a transactional lens, you end up with one very specific side of a career.
Yeah.
If you want diversity, and if you want it to be interesting, and if you want it to sustain you as a career, you've got to kind of challenge yourself through it, and you've got to use what procurement gives you, which is an insight into a breadth of a business rather than just a silo within a business.
Very interesting statement, yeah.
And take it as an opportunity to learn and develop within it.
Yeah.
I think there is, it's picking up those commercial skills. It's learning what makes a good supplier, what doesn't, but also reflecting that on your own business is helpful as well, because it will help you manage some of your own frustrations you'll have at times in terms of what you can and can't do.
Yeah.
And it's casting your net as broad as possible in terms of stakeholders.
Yeah.
And listening and learning. That's what accelerated my career, because I started my procurement career late 20s.
Right.
Most of my early 20s were kind of just trying random things, going back to university, traveling a bit here and there.
Trying to figure out what you wanted to do.
Yeah. And I was very listless and aimless. And when I fell into procurement, it could have been as much as, when I did pensions administration or when I did early childhood services, the various things that I tried in my 20s. But what turned it into a career was, it was the first place I felt unconstrained relatively.
Right.
It's the first place I felt that you were getting a lot of responsibility, probably that you shouldn't get at times.
Right.
But it gave a lot more opportunity than kind of other kind of more structured places I've been in, like finance and accounting and pensions. And, there's a lot more structure in those places. In procurement, you don't have a lot of structure.
Yeah.
So it's taking that as an opportunity and using that to develop yourself, and it offers a lot of creativity within a business. So it's taking that opportunity to, it's a bit rambling, but it's kind of,
that's right.
It's a very open space. So you take advantage of the openness.
Would you say that it's something that you've got a passion for, and that's what's kind of driven you?
I don't know, if I'm honest. I think I enjoy it.
Yeah.
It frustrates me at times because whilst you're across everything, you're never fully in control of everything.
Yeah, agree. Yeah, I understand that.
You get a range of stakeholders, and depending on your stakeholders, that can drive you up and down.
Yeah.
I enjoy the commerciality of it, and I think I've got a passion for the commerciality of it, and doing deals, negotiating, building a procurement process, which, and especially in the public space, because you don't properly negotiate in the public space. Everything is very controlled, and rightly so, because you're responsible for taxpayers' money.
Of course, yeah.
But you've got, what you can do is build a process which drives commerciality and drives, good outcomes, but commercial outcomes.
Yeah.
And it's the creativity in process design, which you can do within public procurement rules. I don't buy the argument that they're restrictive. Right. You've just got to think about your process. You've got to think about your outcomes, and design a process within those rules which drives to that outcome.
Yeah.
Work out what is, motivating. I think the other thing I really like about procurement and commercial management is you get to move people around. You spend. It's very human focused, and you really understand what motivates people. You understand what motivates business, what drives them. But also with your internal stakeholders, a lot of it is, if you have any interest in psychology or kind of political theory, it's a great place to kind of learn and be exposed to a broad range of different people and see what motivates them, see how, and part of our job is to motivate, our supply chain to give us something which works for them and works for us. But, their preferred position is not our preferred position.
No, that negotiation, that meeting in the middle. Yeah.
So you've got to work out how you motivate someone to give you something which isn't their preferred position.
Yeah.
And that I find super interesting. And when I'm challenged in those spaces, in those new stakeholders, those new geographies or whatever, that I'm definitely interested in. I'm still not convinced it's a career, my career anyway.
Yeah.
But it clearly is now.
But you've been in it a while. So.
Yeah, it's over 10 years now. So it clearly is a career. But it's kind of in my back of my mind. I'm still kind of politics student at university type of thing. So
yeah.
You kind of you fall into it and never admit it. But it's.
No, I get that. I mean, I'm still in the Royal Navy 25 years ago, so it's one of those things, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's really, really interesting. Okay, so what do you think the future landscape of procurement looks like? Do you think there's going to be changes because of things like AI or technology, or how do you think things like that will impact the future?
I think there's still an important human element. I think you've got to see technology as an enabler.
Yep.
And I think it's. For my side of procurement, which isn't particularly transactional, when we're not buying widgets, we're very much buying kind of people often. The human interface is still important. I think it helps in terms of things like research and kind of expediting that. I think it helps in terms of process efficiency.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
Agreed.
It helps you manage your data and drives your decision making. You can use it to inform strategy a lot better.
Yeah.
Having a good, I think it's positive in that respect, and I think you've got to see it's not going to go away. It's not going to disappear. No. So you've got to see it as enabling you to do something you want to do, make your life easier, make your life more interesting.
Yeah.
And refocus procurement and kind of how you view yourself in that role. In that, and so I think hopefully, if you buy into procurement and kind of a career, it should make your life easier. It should take away your transactional elements. It should take away the boring side of your job.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult for a machine to negotiate, for example. Because whenever you're talking about a decision that involves finances, or there's an emotive element to it, or you want to work with a certain individual. That tends to be one person and another person as opposed to that.
Yeah. And I think it goes more, I think procurement needs to refocus itself more. And I think, it does to a point, it's more that broader commercial management. Yeah. And I think that's really where the role for procurement people is kind of, it's that value add. It's the fact that you understand the origin of the contract and therefore can manage it and kind of, what you did well there also works over there. So they're not really two distinct roles. You've got to kind of have that buyer, contract manager. I think that's a more rewarding role, hopefully.
Yeah.
And I think that's where people need to see themselves to allow them to be a bit more adaptable for when technology does come in and kind of take away some of those bits where,
Yeah.
So you've got to see it as kind of enabling and kind of giving you the chance to do something in a more creative way, in a more productive way, and hopefully give you more enjoyment within the job. I don't know. That's probably how I'd view it. But
no, I think that's a very interesting insight. I think that makes sense. To be fair, so how do you keep informed about developments within procurement and new ways of working, and the things that you do or things that you look at?
I think mostly it's through your network, and I think that's another, going back to your earlier question about kind of advice for young procurement professionals.
Yep.
There aren't that many of us. Every company buys stuff, but there's actually not that many procurement professionals out there. No. It's a very small pool of people,
right?
And it's an even smaller pool of people who do it very well.
Yeah.
So building a network is super important, and that's how you learn, but it's also how you problem solve. Most times you're buying something, it's very rare that you're the first one buying it for the first time.
Yeah.
So there's a wealth of experience out there. So finding that network, building that network, finding how other people solve problems is really important.
Yeah.
And that's probably the way I keep track of it the most these days. I've got a good peer network within the public. In the public sector, it's a lot easier in the private sector because you don't have that commercial element about it in the same way. So it's easier to kind of share workings and stuff.
You're not all competing against one another.
So kind of the ability to kind of share information and bounce ideas off each other is a lot easier in that space.
Right.
But it's not impossible within the private sector, and there's lots of good forums in which you kind of can do that and kind of, close the door, have a good kind of practical conversation around kind of, your challenges. Finding, research. LinkedIn's more useful than I would like to admit, I think.
Yeah.
Because it is how I keep track of developments. It is.
I do the same thing, Sam. Yeah. I do. Everything seems to be on there. Everybody in terms of my peers are on there. I find LinkedIn a very useful tool.
Yeah, and I do spend a lot of my time in the morning commutes kind of scrolling through kind of posts on there.
I hope you're listening to the Wear Many Hats podcast when you're on your way into work. Thank you.
Podcasts are very much a part of my morning commute. And beyond that, it's professional forums. I used to be very good at kind of keeping abreast of kind of things like SIPs and World Commerce and Contracting.
Right.
But you've got to kind of remember your discipline. I tell my team to do it, make sure they're doing their kind of exams and kind of doing their research, doing their continuing professional development. But it's kind of, I'm not as good at it as doing it myself these days. But I think that's still quite important too.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. Well, look, we haven't stuck to the questions. I never kind of do that, to be fair, Sam. I do apologise. But you've had some very interesting things to say. So, what would you say that your greatest achievements in your career in procurement have been?
I think when I used to work in local authorities, working with some of the social care teams in very difficult environments because, their budgets were being slashed at the time.
Yeah.
I'm proudest of some of those contracts, even though just because of what they're enabling, the people who were doing them, the people I got to work alongside in social care, really were doing it for all the right reasons. They weren't motivated for money in one iota, Some very capable, very smart people who were doing it purely because they believed in the service they were delivering.
Yeah.
So I'm probably proudest of my achievements there and kind of helping them and facilitating some of the challenges they were dealing through kind of the worst elements of austerity.
Yeah.
Kind of a decade ago.
So you kind of like that altruistic element.
Yeah. I don't think it's altruistic. It's more. It's the way things should be. It's providing a service.
I completely agree. Yeah.
Which is a true public service, and it's doing it in a way which is still professional. And I think we were talking earlier. They are some of the most commercial and professional people I've worked with.
Yeah.
Yet paid the least of all the people I've worked with.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed that so much at the time. It was very much a spirit of collaboration and camaraderie, and I was very junior back then, but you were very much part of a broad team. You were kind of there with your commissioning managers, with your commercial contract managers, with your social care managers, and you're all working to the same goals in the same environment. And that was very rewarding, and I'm really proud of the work there. On a more selfish space, I think building the team in BII and where we are today, I'm very proud of too, because it was a blank canvas, and I think we've got it in a very challenging space because we are in that kind of public-private space.
Yeah,
to work in a very efficient way. I've got some immensely capable people in the team, and I'm very proud of what they're achieving, the commerciality they're driving, the outcomes they're driving.
Yeah.
And I enjoy my job a lot more seeing what they get to do now.
Right.
Less about what I'm doing, but more kind of them challenging me, them being incredibly creative in their delivery.
Yeah.
Sitting in meetings and they're being more professional than I'm being in the meeting.
Yeah.
Those things. I feel very proud about kind of their work at the moment.
Right. Okay. Well, that's absolutely fantastic. Great to hear. Thanks, Sam. Okay. So, look, conversely, Any regrets?
I think it took me a long time to kind of work out what my career was and kind of buy into procurement as being, as I said earlier, I still don't 100% convinced that this is my career.
Yeah, I am not a procurement guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's been times where, and I think going back to your earlier question about kind of advice for people entering the profession.
Yeah.
You can be your own worst enemy at times. You can limit yourself. And you don't necessarily value the experiences you're going through because you're focused on what's coming next.
Yeah.
And it's those points in my career where I've been kind of overly angsty, overly teenage. I think they're some of the bits. It's kind of, I've some of the moves you make at times, kind of some of the decisions you choose not to make are driven not by the challenge or opportunity, but more kind of your own angst.
Yeah, fear sometimes. Yeah.
So I think it's those aspects. But I'm in, weirdly, a fairly happy place with it at the moment.
Yeah.
I like the company I work for.
Yeah.
I think we're doing a good job. My life is relatively interesting.
Yeah. We're gonna get onto your life next, Sam.
But yeah, so I think not too many regrets, but it's those times. It's kind of where I've kind of lost focus around my decision making.
Yeah.
And you're making decisions for the wrong reasons. I think that's probably what regrets I do have.
I think that's a fair comment. Really fair comment. Thank you for being so honest. So, we've learned everything you do from a work perspective. So tell us a little bit about what you like to do outside of work. Who is Sam Pickford?
It's very similar to work in some aspects. Right. I like the international side of things. I really like traveling.
Yeah.
I've been fortunate enough to take a career break of 6 months in between contracts before and spend time traveling from Mongolia all the way through down to, I think we ended in Sri Lanka.
Oh, lovely.
Sort of long holiday, really.
Yeah,
It's, I enjoy, learning about the world, learning about different cultures, putting myself in places which do challenge me. And beyond that, it's kind of football. I like football.
Who do you follow?
United, Man U.
Oh, good man. High five. You can come back, Sam.
Yeah.
What do you think of the transfers so far?
I'm okay this season, I think.
Yeah.
I think we seem to have kind of started and finished in the same place in terms of what we were looking at, which is,
I think so.
What was been touted as opportunity, it seems to have been taken, which is good.
Yeah.
I think it's additions which are useful. I don't know. I still think we're a couple of people off.
Yeah, all the West Ham, Arsenal, and Chelsea fans have switched off now.
Yeah, but it's football. Yeah, it's one of my main interests outside of work, I guess.
Yeah, mine as well. I mean, I'm a huge football fan, so great to meet another fellow footballer. Listen, all right, Sam. Well, listen, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the Wear Many Hats podcast. It's been absolutely interesting learning about your role, how you came into the role, and also the advice that you've given to people that want to move into the professional procurement sector. Thank you very much for your time. It's been lovely having you.
Lovely to meet you too. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Cheers.